seems to be a very successful Southeast Asian Breast Cancer Symposium. Indeed, they reserve some of the best for last. Okay. As this morning's session will tackle the topic that's very familiar with everyone, but yet we still need to find out more about it and seek more guidance and even clarification on how to go about it. So they say, advocacy is about changing what is into what should be. And there are so many ways of doing this. So for this session entitled, Many Ways to be an Advocate, we will do exactly that, with speakers from the different parts of the globe. It is my great honor to introduce this morning's speakers, who I admire greatly for the body of work that they have been doing in the fight versus cancer. To kick off this morning, let me introduce the first speaker. Our first speaker is Dr. Julie Torode. Dr. Julie is currently a board member and director of the Strategic Partnerships, Community and Patient Engagements, Global Health Unit, Institute of Cancer Policy at King's College in London. She's also held several leadership roles at UICC and as advisor to the World Health Organization Technical Working Groups on Essential Medicines and Cervical Cancer. She is a visiting scientist and works internationally with United Nations agencies and governments all over the world. Calling from, I think, the UK, Dr. Julie, the floor is yours.
So thank you so much, Paul, and the organizers for this kind invitation. And I'm very happy to talk to you and make the opening remarks to our session. There are many ways to be a breast cancer advocate. And, you know, I talk from my experience in my different roles that Paul has spoken about, but especially as a breast cancer survivor myself after 23 years since my diagnosis and counting. So I'm sure you'll see that that is reflected in my remarks. So as advocates, we often focus on the what, the issue, the problem. You know, we're very focused in explaining what our challenge is. But do we really pay as much attention to think about who are we actually advocating to? What's that level we're aiming for? And if we thought a little bit more closely about that, we might understand our audience and be a little bit more focused. We also need to think about who are we advocating with? We often have a few partners, but just a little bit more thought, thinking across the spectrum of organizations and audiences that may have an interest in the issue, you may find new allies that can help launch your cause, or even further supporters that can help not just financially, but by opening doors. And then the other question is, what can we leverage in our advocacy? You know, are there voices that could really add a strong perspective? Is there experience or expertise where you could bring these people in and really help elucidate your issues? Or are they policies and recommendations that we can lever and really help shore up our arguments? So I'd really ask you to think right across the spectrum of issues and perspectives so that you really shape your plans before you start. There's often different ways to get to the same result, and by doing that, you actually might find a neater or more effective way to get to where you want to be. But I encourage you to use what works for you. You know, you're your own person, your own organization, and make sure you don't lose that style and originality when you're working with others. Other speakers today will highlight their own stories and really look out for what they're telling you and how they've defined their niche and think about what their own drivers are for the great advocacy that they'll be sharing with you. And hopefully will give you some learnings to take into your own work. So what are the levels of engagement as an advocate? Well, when we're first diagnosed, often we spend our time sharing our story as an individual. Of course, you talk to friends and family, but you may go beyond that and share your experience within your own sort of sphere of influence. Some of you may go beyond that and start engaging with other survivors, raising the profile of the lived experience in more general, not just your experience, but others as well. Even public speaking and raising awareness. And some of you may go further and start to talk about the challenges in the hospital system. wanting to address the gaps or inefficiencies that you found in your own treatment and improve that for others, or talk more strongly and work with others to talk about the quality of care and putting your patient voice together with others. Another problem with my slides again now. So what we see as we move across this spectrum is that we start of a shift from an individual story to start talking about population challenges. So whilst so now you're no longer talking about your individual journey, you're talking about the journey of many breast cancer patients in a hospital, maybe breast cancers in the country, or even breast cancer patients or even women in your country. So you're starting to talk about large populations. When we look at population level, we're often starting to look at policy. And here's an example of a cancer plan from Malaysia, which I know took everyone some time to get. But where does breast cancer feature in a policy like this? And you may have heard from Paul in another session about the hard-fought work to establish a Cancer Act in the Philippines. So what other laws or policies are there that might leverage your breast cancer argument? And this is an area where we start to look when we're working at population level, looking at equity in access to services, quality or safety and affordability. We might look across all the needs of breast cancer patients, or we might look at an individual population like early breast cancer or metastatic breast cancer. You can take that population one level further and start to look at a regional level. This is often the way that the World Health Organization works, using the regional level of organization of member states. This is important because you can leverage the peer-to-peer pressure between these different states, but you can also leverage the data. And a great example from the ASEAN region is the catastrophic funding reports that have really helped shine a light on the stress and strain that a cancer diagnosis puts on patients. But then we move to global level. There might be global action plans like this NCD Global Action Plan. There might be a more generic look at access to medicines where you can champion the opportunity of access to breast cancer medicines. And just recently, we've had the launch of the Global Breast Cancer Initiative. So each of these have are a way of raising the opportunity and discussion and advocating for change in breast cancer. But as we move to the population level, we're focused much more on standards, processes, guidelines. We might look at access, availability, and affordability. And of course, research is so important in shaping those arguments. And as you move up to these levels, your partners may become broader. They might be cancer groups rather than just breast cancer groups. They might be groups that work on women's health, not just one area of women's cancers. They might even be people that work on women's rights or NCDs. There are people that just work on access to medicines or health rights. These could all be allies in your advocacy goals. But of course, there's not just one level, and there's really great value in taking the patient story and the patient voice to any of these levels. And actually any information in these levels can be so important for your own personal story and advocacy. And the cross-talk between these is something you shouldn't forget. There are so many ways that one can shore up these arguments for your local advocacy, for your regional advocacy, and for your global advocacy. So leveraging the strength of the patient voice is always important. It makes things real to policymakers who often don't see that reality. Our motivations are personal and from our own lived experience, perhaps an injustice or a gap, or simply uniquely recognizing a new opportunity that you want to champion. The key thing is that we all have the same message and levers for change. We want to reduce incidence. we want to reduce mortality, and we want to maximize quality of life living with a breast cancer diagnosis. These are the same messages of the Global Breast Cancer Initiative. And you might think, oh, that's got nothing to do with me. And one of the challenges when you go at a global level is the higher one goes in the sort of global advocacy space, the less detail there is. But there's such a huge opportunity to leverage these arguments in your national advocacy. So it's not just about 60-80, 60% access to early stage diagnosis, early detection, 60 days to diagnosis, and 80% completion of treatment rate. It's also creating that enabling environment, the support of equitable, affordable, and easy access for all people with breast cancer. And that's where your message comes in, the tailoring to your own unique national or subnational settings. I often get asked what's the difference between advocacy and awareness. They are both important. Awareness is getting issues known, sharing information, sharing opportunities to act. And advocacy is also important. It's pressing for change, building on awareness to press for action and impact in terms of outcomes, and creating the environment for individuals to act. So a challenge to you, ask yourself, am I raising awareness only? Could I or could our group have more impact by taking this further and advocating for change? And could we add value to the breast cancer mission by working in coalition? You don't have to do all of these things, but maybe you can add your special part to a broader coalition of work. I've included some links to some of the documents that I've mentioned in my presentation today. So I'd like to thank you for your attention and encourage you to listen for these arguments as we hear from the other presenters. Back to you, Paul.
Thank you, Doc Julie. Wow, what a way to start this morning. We wanted clarity, and there you got it. A very clear, crystal clear presentation of what advocacy is all about. So please hang on for a while, Julie, as we hear other speakers, and we'll get back to you later on for the Q&A. Okay. So moving on from the UK, we're going to go back to home base here in Manila. And with us this morning is a very good friend. Internationally, she's known as Carmen Auste, but for us here, the locals, we call her lovingly as Menchi. Okay? Menchi has always been in the forefront of the cancer fight in the country, being the CEO of Cancer Warriors Foundation of the Philippines. And she's been very, very active in supporting cancer patients and advocating for greater access to treatment and medicines in the Philippines. I think for breast cancer patients, you know her as one of the key pillars in terms of the UICC program of patient navigation in terms of learning packages for advanced breast cancer. So without further ado, Menchi, it's an honor to be seated with you on this symposium. You can take away, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Paul. Happy to be with you, Julie, and our other two speakers for this particular session. Magandang umaga po sa ating lahat and mabuhay from the Philippines. So I will share with you now a presentation which Julie and I entitled Keeping Your Sanity as You Navigate the Challenges of Policy-Based Advocacy. Could we have the slide, please? All right, so why keeping your sanity? Because most often we think that policy-based advocacy is difficult, not something doable, something that should be left to those who are lawyers or more familiar with the legislative and political environment. But I'm here as an advocate working in the policy environment for the past 40 years, first 15 years, in the context of development work. And when my son was diagnosed with cancer, then an advocate and champion for childhood cancer and cancer as a whole. Next slide, please. As was mentioned by Julie, there are different levels by which advocacy can happen, but there are three major reasons why you would want to engage in advocacy. The first one would be in the context of informing, influencing, and catalyzing decision makers to act. And we call this as the IC. Before they can act, they have to see what you see. They have to feel what you feel. And so later on, we'll see it's not just enough to have data or information. There has to be a way by which we communicate it to them such that they are moved to action. The second one has to do with persuading both political and organizational leaders. So policy advocacy is not limited to government or to legislators. Policy advocacy could happen in your hospitals, in your academic institutions, in wherever you are based. And essentially what you want to do is after they see, to help them to shape policies, programs, guidelines, standards, rules, and regulations. All of these are part of what we call as policy advocacy. And you want it to be shaped to be able to meet the unmet needs of breast cancer patients, survivors, and their families, as well as to be able to advance the concerns and issues that they need to be responded to urgently and immediately. And finally, a very important stream of policy advocacy, especially in the context of post-COVID resiliency and recovery, is the need to be able to mobilize support and resources. And resources here refers to all kinds of resources, from funds to donations in kind, to making sure that we have enough human resources, both in the primary healthcare and the other levels of service delivery, to be able to advance and meet the needs of breast cancer patients and the follow-up care of survivors as well. Next slide, please. So the next question that we usually ask is, whom do I go to? Whom do I reach out to? And what we're saying is, that's why the slides are side by side. First, you need to deeply understand the issue or your asks. In advocacy, we use the term ask, meaning that is what you're asking from. Of course, not in I demand it, but in a very gentle and persuasive way. But the important thing is not only that you clearly elucidate what it is that you're asking for, but that you connect it to the heart. Not just the mind, but the heart of your individuals or organizations. So it says there, know the decision maker, the political leader or legislator. There are four things. What are they passionate about? Has their lives been touched by cancer? When we started the NICA in the Philippines, that was one of the mapping we did. You usually do just a power mapping in terms of influence. This one, we looked at whose lives have been touched by cancer, who has wives, mothers, sisters, other loved ones who have had cancer. And then as well, in terms of knowledge, what they already know and what they still need to know. And Julie, I know you had a question for me here. In terms of being able...
Carmen,
Yes.
that's really interesting about this mapping, but how do you gather that information on decision makers and policy makers? How do you get that intelligence?
Yes, very true. So in the world of the millennials, they Google it. But more than that, we found that in the Philippine context, for example, we use the connect strategy. People who know people, who know people, who know people. And in the process, you're able to gather information as well as looking at all the media blasts, you know, especially in the context of what issues they previously supported or how their lives have been touched by cancer. So you're right, at this first stage, we are like an investigator, a researcher, a detective of sorts, trying to get a deeper understanding of the stakeholders that we would want to serve as our champions. Thank you, Julie. And next slide, please. When we're doing what we call the elevator talk, you know, like you have 2 minutes to get to the floor wherever your champion or advocate is going to, we always say that a very important question is not only what we need from them, but we need to think of how will we make them care? How will it touch their heart such that they feel that it is urgent, that they need to do something, that they are the person to do something about it? Because they could always say, yeah, you need this, you need that, yeah, but there's somebody else who can do that, it's not me. So you need to make them personally care. Remember when we're fixing things around the house, and we have a painting that has been there for quite a while, or you have a new painting, usually just by changing the frame, the painting becomes different. In the same way with these vases that you see around us, just by being able to change what's around it, it becomes different. In advocacy, we call that framing the issue. How do you present or describe the issue in a way that it is able to capture both the heart and the mind of those that you're trying to reach? And usually personal stories of the loss of a mom, the loss of a sister, the loss of a special someone, these actually have, in Tagalog, we call it kurot sa puso, which means like you touch the heart. We had one legislator who, when we went to see him, immediately he asked for the picture of his mom, and he said, "This is my mom. I lost her to breast cancer, and at this point, I commit to you, mom, we're not going to stop until this law is passed." And he was true to his word. Next slide, please. Julie, you need to come and say something about this slide. It says, persuade gently and subtly through open-ended conversations. So often in trainings that we have in advocacy, we are taught to develop messages, to craft messages, and sometimes what happens is people think if they just memorize that message, it's enough. But it's saying it, you need open-ended conversations. Julie?
Yeah, Carmen, I really like your idea of the elevator speech. You know, how many of us have finally got to speak to someone and you just didn't get the words out right? So actually practicing that. You know, what if I bumped into this person? How would I say that? Is such a good way of making sure your words come out in the right order when you do need to say it. And I think what we have to remember as advocates is, you know, it's not a one-time conversation. Quite often you think you have to be sort of aggressive and an activist and sort of really press your point hard. But you know, just remember you're going to meet these people over and over again. You need to be seen as a trusted partner, someone who's speaking from a base of experience, but also committed to work together with a policymaker in future.
I have a nice story about that, Julie, in terms of building a trusted relationship. So there was the civil society or organization person who had been trying to get to a higher level government official till finally he was creative enough. He found out what flight he was going to be in. This was a 2-hour flight, what seat he was going to be in. And so he sat beside him. But like you said, the subtlety was, you know, he just got to talking with him. And then finally, about an hour and a half, the governor, turns to him and says, "By the way, what job are you in?" And that was when he mentioned, "I'm actually an advocate for the cancer community." And he says, "I like you. I like the way you think. Come see me." So yeah, it is not something that you need to push yourself in. You have to be subtle, you have to be gentle. And then in terms of testing out the messages, those who have children or even teens in the house, when I still had them in the house, every time I would try out an advocacy message, I would ask them, "Can you listen to it?" If they understood it, if it excited them, that was good enough for me. Now it's my husband that I test it on. So people in your homes, they're the best way to test out the messages. If they can understand it, it can be understood by our political leaders. Next slide, please. And of course, the very important, we all have a story to tell. I am not a breast cancer survivor, but I lost aunts, nieces, and other loved ones to breast cancer. Those of us as well in the whole community with many breast cancer patients and survivors, the important thing is we have to unlock the power of these stories. We have to be able to weave patient and family experiences and perspectives. Oftentimes in Asia, just like in the Philippines when we were doing our advocacy for the NICA law, we did not yet have all of the full data. But the stories of the survivors, of their families, of the patients, that was what made the most impact. So make sure that you unlock these powers of stories. Next slides, please. We can always do things alone as one organization, but really the important point here is there is power in togetherness. And it's very important for all of us to partner up and to build alliances or coalitions and to look for partner organizations who share similar ideologies and values. Julie, you wanted to ask something about the risks of partnering?
Yeah, Carmen, I think if you're a new organization, you might wonder, are there risks with partnering with other people? And what advice would you have about safeguarding those relationships so that you feel protected when you start partnering with others?
Well, the very important thing is to do our own due diligence. Not everything that you read in Google is really what's happening in those organizations. So you need to ask organizations or individuals that have worked directly with that organization you're looking to partner up. And at the same time, it's also good to get to know them better, have some simple activities before going on to formalizing it. It's just like a love relationship. You start with dates first before deciding to get engaged and to get married. So that would be one of the safeguards in terms of ensuring that really this would be a partner for life, or it could also be just an alliance for a one-time thing. That's okay as well. One date, we remain friends. That can be working as well. Next slide, please. And finally, we have this slide. In terms of the power of togetherness, we often think that we only need to build relationships with legislators or political and organizational leaders. And as Paul knows, we need to be able to reach out to the gatekeepers, the drivers, the secretaries, anybody who's around, the wives, the family, the children. And we find that they often have the greatest influence, especially in terms of both political and organizational leaders. And of course, in terms of your ministries, you don't necessarily have to have relationships with those on top, but you need to have relationships for those in the middle, because there are often those that stay even when there are changes in terms of elections and so on. So let's build those relationships. They are the key to collaboration. Fast forward to next two slides, please. So just go ahead. Yes, essentially, in terms of communication, there will be a presentation after me in terms of going digital, but what we would also encourage is it's important to use multiple channels of communication. Millennials have a different way, senior citizens like myself a different way, and we find that with the elder generation, especially those that are not tech savvy or have tech challenges, they still prefer face-to-face community type of engagements, and that's something that we need to be able to do as well. So essentially segmentize and then have targeted types of communication. Next slide, please. Patience, persistence, and compromise. Advocacy is not easy, it takes time. In some countries, it takes 9 years for a law to be passed, 3 years for a policy. But throughout all those, you should not lose hope. You should continue to believe that it can be done. And more importantly, you have to be willing to compromise as well. In the Philippines, when we began the passage of the law, there was a decision, do we engage with industry and pharmaceuticals? There were some who felt it's a no-no. There were those of us who believe we need to work with everyone. And so from the very beginning, we engaged with the industry, asking them about their needs and getting their feedback as well. And we worked very well in that setting. Last question, Julie, before we move on to my closing, in terms of compromise.
Yeah, I mean, I suggest, an experience from myself is, you need to know your framing, really. There are some things you don't want to compromise on, but you have to be open to achieving what you want by being willing to cede on certain things. A good example would be in the NCD discussions at global level. We insisted that 3 targets were not enough and fought very hard to get many more targets in, but we were able to compromise on certain issues to make sure that policymakers didn't abandon the issue completely. So I'm sure you've made compromises along the way, Carmen.
Yes, values-based compromise, because as you said, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. So to be able to survive in the long term and to be successful, we need to identify what are non-negotiables and what can we compromise on. And last slide, please. From Steve Jobs, it has to do with, while advocacy is difficult and challenging, in order to keep your sanity and to enjoy it and to find meaning in it, you have to enjoy it. And he says, if you're working on something exciting that you really care about, you don't have to be pushed, the vision will pull you. And finally, for those who are joining us, and are cancer survivors or going through the cancer journey, cancer is only going to be a chapter in your life, not the whole story. And part of cancer and your life story is the challenge for each one of you. From being inspired, let's move on to being involved, to being fully engaged. Speak up, stand up, find connections, move on from being a survivor to being a warrior, a champion, and advocate. And we're looking forward to seeing you out there in the trenches. Back to you, Paul.
Wow. Thank you so much for that, Mench. Every time I work with Menchie, there's this feeling of, of positivity and embracing you, So thank you for that comprehensive presentation. It's always very inspiring. So Menchie and I have a common denominator, if I may say so. Both of us are obviously in the cancer fight because of our sons. Okay, so Menchie is mother to James, who survived cancer, and of course, my son, Sevi, also survived cancer. That's the reason why when she was appointed as part of the 3-man civil society representative to the Cancer Council, we were extremely happy that the voice of parents as well, aside from patients, will be included. Okay, so hang on for a while, Menchie. We will get back to you during the Q&A. But moving on, we will hear from someone from the other side of the world this time. We're hearing from Ms. Julia Moest. She is a cancer patient advocate, and she began being involved in support groups and advocacy work when she first spoke for research fundraising activity. She served in the 2018 Living Beyond Breast Cancer Hear My Voice class of volunteers. Julia created GRASP, G-R-A-S-P, which stands for Guiding Researchers and Advocates to Scientific Partnerships. With the help of her friend Christine Hodgdon, GRASP is a patient-led initiative to bring patient advocates and scientists together for a guided walkthrough of scientific posters presented in the San Antonio Breast Cancer Symposium. I'm extremely excited to listen to this talk, so we'll turn over the floor to you. Take it away, Julia. Okay, so as Julia is preparing to share his screen, a lot of times, when I first heard of this particular topic, I was extremely excited primarily because in the advocacy world, you seldom hear about research and scientific partnerships. That's the reason why, this particular discussion of being brought here through this symposium actually is quite interesting to listen in. So take it away. The floor is yours.
Can you see my slides?
Not yet. We can see you though. There you go. Just put it on full screen. Thank you. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Yes, thank you so much. So I'm in Washington, D.C. So I thought I had a hard time with 11 o'clock, but I'm sorry, Julie, 4 a.m. seems a lot harder than that. I'm not going to complain. So I'm here to talk about research advocacy. So as you heard earlier, there are a number of different types of advocacy that patients and caregivers can get involved in. And one of them is research advocacy, when the patient advocates work with the researchers and scientists that work on cancer. And it's a newer type of advocacy. I'd say the big break happened in the 1990s. So in the United States, a group called the National Breast Cancer Coalition was very involved in pushing for patients being heard in research. And they went as far as lobbying Congress and creating a whole funding mechanism that includes patients in a level that was not seen before, and is still pretty groundbreaking today. So what is research advocacy? It's a partnership between researchers and advocates, allowing the patient experience to inform the process of cancer research. So this can be done in a number of different types of research. Importantly, and I think for me, this is one that is very special, is all the people that dedicate their lives to studying cancer, but never actually work with patients. So bringing a patient to scientists in labs that look at the cancer cells in a microscope, but don't actually talk with a human being that experiences that disease. So here I have listed a few of the reasons why it's important, and there are benefits to both sides. So I think researchers, they get meaning and purpose. Their job is very hard. They did not choose to do it because it's easy, because the money is good, because it's easy to get a degree, because the hours are good. It's a really, really hard job, and they choose it because they want to impact people's lives. And when they meet patients that are living because of treatments developed by scientists, then what I've heard from people before is they want to go to work earlier the next day, and they want to work harder because there's a big reason why they're doing what they're doing. When they meet patients, they see a human being dealing with that disease, and it becomes not a petri dish, but an actual life. And that sense of urgency really is striking. So when researchers work with patients, then they can help educate the patient community. So a patient that is talking to the patient community has a whole different perspective and a way to communicate with other patients. More generally, it really expands the understanding of science. It helps with their burnout. Most of the experiments they do fail, and I have heard from a number of scientists saying that sometimes you wonder, why am I still doing this? Like I could get a great job somewhere else and not have to struggle this much to get grants and things like that. But meeting patients and realizing, oh, I can actually get this mother to be there for her child's graduation, or it also is very inspirational for the young scientists, the trainees that are entering or deciding if they're staying in the profession. When patients work with scientists, they make that science more impactful on actual lives. And when you can do that, then when you can have elevator speeches about why this research matters, that really makes it more fundable. People understand why it matters, and that is easier to support. And I think the biggest thing that I always tell scientists is, we will challenge you, we will give you hard questions, but at the end of the day, there's no one that wants you to succeed more than patients, right? We want scientists to succeed more than the scientists themselves, because for them it's their career, their job. For us, it's our lives that depend on it. And for patients, there are a number of benefits as well. It does give us meaning when we start giving back and working on advocacy and helping future patients. It really brings hope. Nothing brings me more hope than a than a young, brilliant scientist that is really eager to do work and, impact the lives of people living with the disease. It allows patients to become more educated and really take the reins about what they want to do, what is coming up the pipeline, what next treatment they can explore, what clinical trials there are. It gives the patient community a seat at the table. So when decisions are made about what research will be funded, and having a patient there to really share their perspective is very important. Having patients in these discussions can help reduce the burdens that patients have to experience in clinical trials. And it also highlights the burdens and struggles that patients experience from the treatments. So here's a little cartoon that depicts how even doctors who are often researchers, but they see patients themselves, and even doctors, they're still not the people that are living with the disease every day, parking in the hospital parking lot, having to deal with the long wait to get into the infusion, or the fact that the side effect drugs may be causing side effects that then need to be taken care of, and all of these issues that if you're not actually living it, you simply don't know it as well. But so this has been a big, just a big struggle for scientists and patients. How do they find each other, right? How do you create these connections? And we often joke that a scientist can't just walk into the infusion clinic and say, "Hi, everyone, anyone taking this drug? Because I'm looking at it in my mice in the lab. I would love to chat with you." It doesn't work like that, right? That's not a connection that can easily be made. Christine and we created an organization that tries to make those connections. And it started when she was at ASCO, the big conference in Chicago, and she was walking the poster sessions with a friend that happens to be a scientist. And that experience that they had, stopping at a poster, talking about what it was, what that research was, and the patient adding what the patient perspective is. Oh, this is the drug that causes that side effect. Oh, this person had to deal with a similar clinical trial, and these were the hardships, and the scientist on the other hand saying, "Oh, that's a beautiful survivorship curve. Let me explain what that means." And we thought that was a very important just interaction between two people at that level. And it's informal, it's honest, it's authentic, it's small, so people can be comfortable. And this is how GRASP started. So what we do is we bring scientists and patients together as equal partners in small groups to have conversations about science. And we call it exchanges of ideas. It's very informal. People are encouraged to share their experience, their opinions, to listen to different perspectives, and it adds all those benefits that I covered earlier in the slide. And it really helps the scientists also communicate what they are doing, what the science is, and it really brings hope to patients to learn what the upcoming science is. So our organization serves both the scientists, and we include researchers in labs, epidemiologists, and also the doctors that see patients and do research. And then we also serve the advocates, and that includes patients, caregivers, or someone that advocates for patients. the way it works is we have a small group, an experienced advocate, which we call a mentor, a scientist, and 3 or 4 patient advocates, and they can have different levels of experience. And you can see on the top photo, that's a grasp discussion of a poster. So a number of people are standing around the poster author. They're asking questions. They are adding their perspective as patients or as scientists. So one thing that's really interesting for me in that photo is you don't know who's the patient, who's the scientist. These are all women that are interested in this work, and they have information to learn and to add to the discussion. And obviously with the pandemic, we had to move everything online. So we have a similar discussion to the one on the left. We have virtually, and we share the screen with the poster, and people have a small breakout room where they talk about that science. We also started creating a network of people. So on our website, people sign up for an account and they provide some information about themselves, some demographics, their interests. And the idea is that we would have the ability to match people with others that have similar interests. And at this point, we're over 1,000 people between researchers and advocates. About 70% are patient advocates. So I just want to thank a group of patient advocates and scientists that have been really important in getting this work out there, and the discussion of including scientists into, or patient advocates into the science sometimes has some pushback, but it really, really has big champions, and these people are making a big change. So what our tagline is that together, patients and cancer researchers can advance more breakthroughs. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julia. Well, indeed, research advocacy is relatively new, or really a new idea on this part of the world, but it's quite interesting to listen to the whole process that you guys did with GRASP. And the whole idea of making science as a friend is really quite an interesting proposition. And I guess if you're in the cancer fight, then that's a next big step that we all have to embrace. So please hang on for a while. We'll get back to you later on as we open the floor for questions and answers. Okay? But in the meantime, we have our last speaker, definitely something that we all have to listen to. We have Stacey Tinianov. She's a founder of Advocates for Collaborative Education. She is an independent consultant at George Washington University Milken Institute of Public Health. She's one of the contributors to the ASCO, or the American Society of Clinical Oncology, educational book article, which entitled Fear of Cancer, Recurrence or Progression, What is it and what can we do about it? Which, as of today, is the 3rd most downloaded article for 2022. She's a cancer survivor, a patient advocate, a research advocate, and a policy advocate. She considers herself a voice for people who had their voices cut short by cancer. She's a bridge builder, a needle mover, an educator, strategist, and communicator. Definitely not the least, please welcome Ms. Stacey Tinianov. The floor is yours, Stacey.
Thank you, Paul. Can you let me know when my slides are up?
So it's loading.
Or I can share them.
There you go. So your slides are up, so please take it away.
Fantastic. Thank you all. Thank you for having us here, and thank you for hanging in. I will try to go through this a little bit quickly so we have some time for questions. But if you move on to the next slide, I really just want to acknowledge, has the next slide gone up? I just really want to acknowledge everybody in the room. It was actually the slide with all of the people on it. I'm not used to not sharing my own slides, so apologies. All of you who are in the room, whether you're patients, whether you're care partners, whether you're advocates, whether you're new advocates, or whether you've been doing this for a while, you are definitely considered part of our global family. And so I want to thank you for investing your time and your effort and your energy in this space. Next slide, please. So you've heard today that there are a bunch of different kinds of advocacy. I started as an advocate for my mother who was diagnosed with breast cancer, and 4 months later I was diagnosed with breast cancer. So I became a self-advocate. I think that is a relatively hard thing to do for some people, but once you get past that, as many of you may have found, it starts to build on itself. And so you like to start to advocate for changes across the landscape. So patient advocacy, research advocacy, which you just heard Julia speak on, policy advocacy, which you heard Carmen speak on, and then the whole of the community advocacy, which I think we're all a big part of. Next slide, please. So across all of these different flavors of advocacy or types of advocacy, we really have a lot of common goals. A lot of those goals are around access, access to knowledge, access to screening or diagnostic testing, treatments, or even making research more accessible. Equity, it doesn't really matter what country you're in or what community you're in within a certain country. There are a lot of challenges in equity in care and access to that care. Personalization, we have advanced, we meaning the global community has advanced relatively amazingly in science and what we're allowed to do and what we're capable of doing from personalizing treatments, and yet we need to have institutions that help us access those personalized treatments, access diagnostic testing, or even just make choices that are more relevant to our lives. But altogether, we have goals of improving quality of life and reducing premature death. Next slide. But we have millions of people every year who are continuing to be diagnosed with cancer, and we have tens and tens of millions more than that that are considered survivors. And so globally, there are many things that we can actually learn from each other, but often the distance makes it very, very challenging. Next slide, please. And so it's not for everybody, as Carmen mentioned. A lot of times advocacy, policy advocacy, as she was talking about, needs to be done face-to-face, but technology can be a bridge. It bridges geographic boundaries. It can eliminate a lot of additional barriers. In the U.S., where I'm based, it was very challenging, as you heard Julia mention, to get face-to-face with a researcher or face-to-face with a clinician that was not your own. A lot of these people are using technology, just as a lot of patients and a lot of advocates are using technology. We also, starting very recently, can get conference access. So you heard a couple of people mention ASCO. ASCO, we were able to attend without registration fees if we did online access. Technology can be very active, meaning you can be in it, you can be on Twitter, you can be on Facebook, you can be in platforms, or it can be very, very passive, and you can use it as a tool to bring information to you and to help share information out with other people. You can do it synchronously, meaning everybody can be kind of in the same digital space together, kind of like what we're doing right now, or you can do it asynchronously with recordings, with videos, with tweets, with posts. But I think the biggest thing is that technology allows us to have 24/7 access every hour, every day to education and to support. Next slide, please. So I don't feel like we have a good amount of time to go through this, and even if we had an hour, we probably couldn't get through all of this in detail. But what I've put in this slide, which I think all of you will have access to, is several different platforms. So Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. There are closed platforms for patients to kind of talk to each other. Snapchat, TikTok. There are benefits and challenges to each one of those as technology using technology as a bridge. I just want to open your eyes, if they're not already open, to leveraging that and learning how to find out what platform might work for you, depending on what type of advocacy you feel like doing and depending on what type of agenda you're trying to share. Next slide, please. What you see here, and this is several different screenshots from long ago, but there was an individual in San Francisco who had a question. She posted that question on Twitter, and there was an individual in the United Kingdom that helped to amplify that question. And when she amplified that question, she used the hashtag BCCWW. And what that did was it alerted a bunch of other people who were also in this breast cancer community that there was somebody out there with a question. And you can see the responses that she got from really all over the world. I just happened to highlight, 2 different states in the US. Next slide, please. So Twitter is obviously a tool, and if you're familiar with the US and Twitter, it can be used for good or it can be used for evil. As an advocate, you can use it for good. There is an organization that we created called Advocates for Collaborative Education, and it started with a tweet. It started during COVID, ASCO 2020, and a woman who is an advocate in colorectal cancer was asking about leading practices for helping to encourage people to look into clinical trials. I responded to her. We started this conversation and said, wow, we might learn a lot from each other, even though we have very, very different disease types. And so we created this community where we share leading practices. We share leading practices across all of the advocacy types that you've heard about today, about all cancer types, about all geographies, and about all the different communities within those geographies. We have an email group, we have a LinkedIn, and we have a Twitter, and we would love to have you join. But I think ultimately what I want to leave you with is, again, there is a big wide world out there, a big wide world of advocates. As Carmen mentioned, we are all focused on the same thing. And I wrote down that she said that there's power in togetherness, and I want to lean into that. If you can go to the next slide, please. And I want to leave you with just a very small picture of kind of, again, the family that we are excited to welcome you into. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Stacey. I'm not sure if you're familiar in this part of the world, Stacey, that we consume one of the highest number of hours for social media. So definitely in terms of technology, that's something that we should actually get into as part of our advocacy. Okay, so please hang on for a while as I now open the floor for our Q&A. But before I do that, I just want to read one comment from the chat box and a message from Nena, who basically said, "Good morning, excellent symposium, so informative and so inspirational." Thank you, Nena, for that. I want to kick off this Q&A by asking Doc Julie one very basic question, actually. We have varied types of people watching us, but I think the very basic question that I would ask is, which advocacy should we choose? No? I think given the whole menu of advocacy is being laid out today, which advocacy, or how do we choose? I think that's a better question. How do we choose the advocacy to get into? So, Doc Julie?
Is that to me, Paul? Yeah, look, it's where, what's your issue defines where you need to speak, I think. So as I said in my very first slide, you really think about what is my challenge and how do I find a way, where is the key lever for change? And doing that landscaping is very important, that Menchie also explained, working out not just who to influence, but who's already working in that space. And that will give you a very natural, a sort of niche that you can find and you can lever as an advocate. So sometimes, I'm working on the global stage, I'm talking to UN agencies, I'm going to key meetings where governments get together. But another time, I'm at national level working with an advocate that's got an issue and wants some support. So I think we must be very flexible. But when you're working out what do I need to do to make change, it's very much doing that landscaping and taking one step at a time. You know, I think we always want to do these big leaps. And to get to, you know, take a big leap, you actually have to take a few small steps first. So taking those steps, really getting some momentum before you really do that big leap.
Menchi, you want to chime in? Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with all that Julia said. In addition, it could be a mix and match. Like as I was listening to our last presenter, many of our political leaders actually have Facebooks, Twitter, and so on. So when we were doing our initial reach out, that was one of the things that we also tried to find out. On which social media platforms are they? And then Paul was very good at this. He was tagging them. And then at certain points, you know, when they're going to defend a particular issue, they would come in that reminder that, how about in terms of cancer? What would you like to do about it? So, you know, very subtle reminders. And of course, for low-income countries like ours, WhatsApp and Viber and Messenger are so good in terms of keeping the communities together as well. And the research, definitely, that's something we're not doing yet, but we have a strong research community, so we're very inspired by that. So really, I see it now as a mix and match of these different types.
Yeah. Well, speaking of research, I want to throw straight one question to Stacey. But in the interest of time, let's try to be very concise with our answers. You know, again, Menchi mentioned it's quite new to us. What do you think are the challenges that we face? I mean, coming from a lens of a third world or low or middle income country, what do you think would be the challenges in terms of really embracing research advocacy?
Paul, did you want that for me,
Sorry,
or did you
I'm
want that
supposed
for
to
Julia?
throw that question to Julia. Sorry, apologies for that one. Yeah, but don't worry, Stacey. I have one question for you coming up as well. Yeah.
Not worried. Yeah, no, so I actually understand that really well. I'm originally from Brazil, and when I speak with people back home about research advocacy, this is definitely a problem, right? The other types of advocacy are not even happening. In fact, I don't know how it is in the Philippines, but in Portuguese, there is no word for advocate. We use the word advocate in English because there's no word for this role. But I think it doesn't have to be very high level, very cutting edge. It's often about the human connection, and there are people doing research on cancer, and there are people living with cancer, and I know you have both of those people in the Philippines. So it's really about connecting them, and it doesn't have to be a big grant proposal or anything like that. It can be, you know, a chat, a coffee, a visit to the research institution. So I think it can be small, like Julie said.
Thank you for that. Stacey, now to you. So, well, we talk about technology, and as we all know, advocacy, a lot of it is really anchored on the right information. But we are also in the era of disinformation, you know. So how do you balance it off, or how do you fight this off as you move forward or push for your own advocacy?
So I want to answer that because it's really important. I also want to touch on the research piece, because I think what Julia said is so important, that there's all these different levels of research advocacy, and sometimes connection is the most important piece. However, you can also start to drive research advocacy by elevating health literacy in the community and getting access to papers, helping researchers learn how to communicate to people who don't have advanced degrees is such a critical need, regardless of where you are. And it's a great way to dip your toes in the research advocacy space. As far as digital everything and misinformation, disinformation, trust. You need to go to where there is already established sources that you trust. For Twitter specifically, we have hashtags. There's a whole cancer ontology for pretty much every type of cancer out there. I talked in the presentation about the hashtag BCCWW. There's also a hashtag BCSM, which tends to be a little bit more US focused. Use those hashtags because we are a community. We do already kind of self-moderate. So if somebody goes in and posts something that says, if you eat 2 pounds of blueberries a week, you won't have cancer anymore, which we all know is not true. We will help make sure that everybody knows that, one, that's not true, and two, we get that taken down. But you bring up a great point that just because you see it or read it on the internet does not make it real. The other great thing to know about, again, these digital communities is oncologists and researchers are also getting involved in them. If somebody is an oncologist, if they presented at ASCO, if you can find them with AACR, they're giving you the latest and greatest, and that's pretty much all you can ask.
Thank you so much. I have a number of questions, but I'm looking out now here, and they're all actually putting up the banner that says wrap up. So I guess I have to conform because I think we're going over time. But I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for all the time, and it's been a great honor for me to be seated and to share this symposium with you. So with that, we're wrapping up this session. Thank you and good morning, good evening, whichever part of the world you're in. I know some of us are now having breakfast, like Dr. Julie, and or it's still too early for breakfast. But nevertheless, thank you so much for spending your day with us. Maraming salamat po. Mabuhay mula sa Pilipinas.